A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
Birthdays are supposed to be joyful celebrations, but as I turn 28 today, the only thing I feel is a gnawing sense of finality. I'm sitting here in my dimly lit apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the sparse whispers of my own doubts echoing off the walls, a sinister symphony that harmonizes with the rain tapping softly against the window panes. My social media feeds are flooded with happy birthday messages from friends and family, their words empty echoes that resonate hollow in the chambers of my mind. They don't know what I know, none of them do. I guess that's why I'm writing this now, a confession of sorts to whomever might stumble upon it after tomorrow. Maybe my story will serve as a warning or, perhaps, a shred of proof that some of the terrors that swim just beneath the surface of our everyday life are all too real. It was 6 months ago when things began to unravel. I got an email from a sender I didn't recognize, a simple subject line reading your future. Thinking it was spam, I almost deleted it, but an inexplicable compulsion made me open it. The email contained a single sentence: "In 6 months, on your 28th birthday, the world will reset, and only you will remember." I laughed it off at first, a joke surely, probably some sort of marketing stunt. But something in the pit of my stomach churned uneasily as if warning me subconsciously. As days turned into weeks, a series of inexplicable occurrences began to haunt my life. It started with the little things: keys disappearing, lights flickering, shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye. I quit drinking caffeine and tried to shake off the paranoia, attributing it to lack of sleep and stress from work. But then the dreams started. Every night, I found myself in a vast, empty world, eerily silent except for a low hum emanating from nowhere. I was always alone, surrounded by a dense fog that played tricks on my mind, teasing glimpses of figures that vanished whenever I tried to focus. Upon waking, the details would slip away, leaving only an unsettling residue of fear. Around month 3, reality itself began to fray. Time seemed to distort, minutes stretched into hours, or sometimes fell away like dead leaves from a tree. People I knew appeared slightly different, a mole that wasn't there before, an unfamiliar expression in their eyes. I even caught glimpses of strangers on the street whispering my name. Convinced I was losing my mind, I sought help from a therapist who prescribed medication that did nothing to dull the surreal dissonance of my existence. Desperation drove me back to the email. I spent nights researching, looking for clues, patterns, anything that made sense of this looming deadline. I found forums, corners of the internet filled with people like me, receiving cryptic messages, sharing a vision of an impending reset. Most posts were filled with hysteria, but some claimed they could stop it, talking of rituals or extreme acts of sacrifice. Their ambiguity and lack of coherence left me skeptical, but the sense of camaraderie was a lifeline. 5 more months passed in a haze, reality tying knots around my brain. I retreated from friends and family, their faces now unfamiliar masks I couldn't trust. My nights were spent poring through conspiracy theories, ancient texts, and urban legends, desperately seeking an answer or way out. It's now the eve of my birthday, and I'm no closer to understanding what's happening or what's about to unfold. There's just one thing I cling to, a recurring fragment from my dreams, a voice that finally broke through the hum, a child's voice. It said, "Open your eyes," just before everything went dark. I woke this morning resolute, the clarity paradoxically arising from a decision to embrace the inevitable. I'm prepared to end it tomorrow, before it can end me, but there's a part of me whispering that perhaps this darkness isn't something to fear. The strange serenity I find myself in tells me that maybe, just maybe, the reset isn't a cataclysmic end but rather a chance for rebirth, a cleansing of the chaos plaguing my reality. And yet, as I pen this last rambling confession, doubt seeps back in, mingling with the rainfall outside, whispering, "Save yourself." Tomorrow I will walk to the edge of reason, clutching the ties to my intangible whispers. If this is my end, reader, remember my story not as a descent into madness but as a testimony to the terror lurking beneath our fabricated normalcy. If you wake tomorrow remembering something you cannot place, a face, a world, a life, perhaps you've survived another reset. And perhaps, so have I. A myth asshole for telling my sister no to taking in her kids? It seems like a simple question, and maybe at first glance, I am the asshole. But once you hear what happened, maybe you'll understand. It was just after midnight when the first call came through. My sister Clara was hysterical, barely coherent, her voice nothing but a trembling whisper mingling with the static and crackle of a poor connection. They came back, she managed to choke out before the line abruptly went dead. My heart pounded like a tribal drum in my chest, Questions swirling in my mind like a swarm of angry wasps. Only a week ago, Clara had confessed about the ominous visits she'd been receiving, things she couldn't explain and that defied reason, a feeling of being watched, shadows creeping along walls, doors opening in the dead of night. I brushed it off as stress. She was now a single mother of 2 energetic boys after the tragic and sudden passing of her husband, Kevin, in a supposed hit-and-run accident. She'd become paranoid, understandable given her circumstances. But when the house phone rattled against its cradle and her line went silent once more, I grabbed my car keys and headed to her house, the dark highway unfolding like a predatory beast under my headlights. The house was eerily still when I arrived, an unsettling air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand upright. I pushed the front door open, and an oppressive silence flooded over me. Clara's home, once filled with laughter and the exuberance of young children, now felt hollow, like a tomb. "Clara?" I called out, my voice echoing into the void. A shiver ran down my spine as I moved deeper into the house. The hallway light flickered nervously as I approached the living room, and there I found them, Clara huddled in a corner, clutching her children, her eyes wide and glistening like those of a hunted animal. She looked up at me, desperation etched deep into her features, stammering for me to understand the severity of what was happening. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thudding of my heart. "Watching, lurking. Always waiting." Any lingering skepticism I held evaporated. There was a tangible darkness in the house, a malevolent presence that seemed to throb with its own energy. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth caught in my throat. I'd felt it too, the oppressive gaze from the shadows, like multitudes of eyes, each pinning us in place. Then, a dull, resonant thrumming shook the house, emanating from the very floors beneath us. The windows rattled in their frames as I felt an involuntary chill climb my spine. Clara's children whimpered, clutching their mother tighter, their small bodies trembling with fear. "Please, take them," she pleaded, desperation clinging to her words. She pointed to a suitcase she'd packed, as if expecting me to whisk her sons away, to give them a refuge from whatever terror plagued her home. But something primal screamed at me not to take a step further. It was a strange, uncanny sensation, a voice, their voice perhaps, reverberating within my skull. An incoherent whisper, promising no, demanding that they stay. My legs felt like lead as Clara begged me once more, tears streaming down her face, her body racked with sobs. And it was the boys I looked at then, really looked into their eyes. For the briefest moment, their pupils seemed to shift, like shadows darting through their gaze before it vanished into normalcy. Yet, that slip was enough to root me in place, a cold realization prickling along my skin. I knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, they weren't safe, but neither was I or anyone else. The darkness had marked them, claimed their fragile, innocent lives as an entry into our world. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my ears, the air around me growing thicker, weightier. I felt it would swallow me whole if I allowed it. Rational thought was unspooling fast, and the urge to flee was overwhelming. I backed away slowly, hearing Clara's voice following me, rising in panic, her pleas twisting into accusations. I should have carried those boys to safety, taken them away, but something prevented me as if invisible hands held me in check. The air shivered, growing dense with a presence I couldn't deny. It hung between us, a choice, a barrier, a warning. The moment I crossed the threshold with those children would mark my fate and theirs as inextricably bound to whatever watched from the darkened corners. I left the house, staggered into the night, every instinct urging me to bold, to drive as fast and as far from them as I could. Clara's cries echoed in my mind as I stumbled back to my car, feeling the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on me like a vice as the darkness swallowed me whole. I considered reaching out, telling someone, but who would believe me? Perhaps this was her reality now, or mine if I let it. Silent whispers still echo in my dreams, pulling me back to those nightmarish moments. I find myself questioning the boundaries of reality, teetering on the edge of an unsettling truth. Was I the asshole for leaving them there, or would taking them have unleashed something far worse? Late at night, long after the town has sunk into a mournful quiet, I still hear Clara's desolate voice, calling out from the dark, her words a chilling refrain that never fades. I've always known the job came with quirks, but nothing prepared me for the reality as a tribal correctional officer on the margins of the world, where legends still wove through the fabric of daily life like whispers carried on the wind. My first day set the stage with a list handed to me. Darlene, the seasoned officer, her eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories, instructed, "These are the 5 rules you must follow if you want to survive here." Rule 1 was deceptively straightforward: never cross the threshold of the visitor's center until the sun had fully risen. At first, this seemed like mere formality, perhaps a nod to local tradition or just typical early morning protocol. But when I broke it, eager to catch a glimpse of the inmates' morning routines, the shadows seemed to ripple and shift perceptibly, as if the walls themselves resented my untimely presence. The brisk, northern wind bit through my uniform, echoing with a persistent, low moan. Soon enough, I realized Rule 1 wasn't about morning routines, it was about the protection afforded by the light of day. Rule 2 bound us tightly to the territory's spiritual roots: never touch the iron gates unless you had first walked the sacred grounds, a small patch of earth cradled by ancient trees behind the facility. An odd practice, to be sure, yet breaking it once taught me an unforgettable lesson. An icy surge coursed through my veins upon touching that cold, rusty metal without paying respects, leaving my hand numb and tingling for hours. Darlene found me rubbing my hand frantically against my leg, muttering under her breath, "You'll learn, we all do." There was no reprimand, just a solemn understanding among those who worked here about forces at play beyond bureaucratic mandates. Rule 3 was a grave one, hushed and shadowed in warning with its utterance: any inmate, particularly the ones who spoke in chants during certain moonlit nights, should never be interrupted. Interrupting these low, vibrational hymns could trigger things that were best left undisturbed. The first time I heard it, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't language as we knew it, it was primal, affecting the air, setting it abuzz with invisible electricity. We were to walk away, offer a silent prayer, and let the chant run its natural course, for the stories passed down spoke of spirits called forth and shackles unseen clanging against ethereal bars when their rhythm was halted. By the time I encountered Rule 4, I was well versed in the uncanny: never eat food left unaccounted for in the mess hall, no matter how innocuous it seemed. An offering, it was said, to the ancestors who watched over the grounds. One bite from an unmarked apple left on a counter too tempting in my early days there sent my world spiraling. Hallucinations of figures towering over my bed at night ensued, and Darlene found me wandering the halls at midnight, caught in a sleepwalking nightmare unable to wake. She led me back to my bunk, all without a word, just a knowing shake of her head, before she rattled off a cryptic prayer at the foot of my bed. The fifth and final rule was the most perplexing, hinted at with half-breathed anecdotes: never linger near the old cemetery after hours. Nestled just beyond the corral, it lived under perpetual fog as if nature herself whispered sorrow over its resting occupants. The night I neglected that rule, enthralled by the moon's distorted reflection in the mist, was the night I finally understood. I heard a voice, an impossible, deep resonance that thrummed in spaces between sound and silence. "You don't belong here," it spoke, not through threat but a mournful decree. Each step I took back towards the facility, the vegetation seemed to clutch at me, windswept and pleading. It was then Darlene found me, her lantern's light casting a glow, and with a voice as ancient as the lore she uttered, "Every place has its rules. Ours just come from deeper roots." These rules, as irrational as they seemed, had purpose, an unspoken pact between our modern duties and the spirits entwined with the land's history. Living them became second nature, a dance of respect and survival. Over the years, I watched new recruits come and go, many dismissing the rules as mere tribal superstition until the land taught them otherwise. Some fled, others stayed but carried a haunted look, bearing witness to things beyond the sight of those untouched by these tales. Curiously, the rules that once felt like a binding contract became my tether, an understanding that some things are timeless and intangible. In those moments of quiet compliance, amidst tales of shadows and echoes, I found a strange solace within this circle of history and haunting, accepting the whispered legacy that flowed like a hidden stream beneath this place of stone and spirit. The wind howled through the skeletal trees that lined the dimly lit street as I slowly made my way towards my brother's place. There was always something uneasy in the way the shadows clung to the corners of those cracked sidewalks, as if waiting to whisper secrets to anyone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to listen. My brother, Aaron, had invited me over for dinner, and reluctantly, I agreed. The night was black as pitch by the time I reached his old Victorian house, its looming silhouette akin to those Gothic horrors where every creak in the floorboard seems to tell the tales of restless spirits. I shivered, not from the cold October air, but from an unsettling feeling I couldn't quite shake off. As I opened the creaky gate and stepped onto the overgrown path, I caught a flicker of movement from one of the upstairs windows, but when I looked again, the curtain rustled back into place, the room above disappearing into an abyss of darkness. It was nothing, I told myself. Just kids playing. Aaron had 2 children, Tommy and Lizzie, both under 10 but with the combined chaos of a tornado. The moment I stepped into the house, I was met with an overpowering scent of something burnt mingling with cinnamon, an assault on the senses if ever there was one. Aaron greeted me with a slap on the back, acting like all was well, as if we hadn't spoken less in the last 6 months and I wasn't here out of some obligatory need to reconnect. But his smile faltered for a split second, his eyes betraying a hint of tension. That's when I knew something wasn't quite right. Dinner was a cacophony of noise, the television humming some cartoon theme song and the kids clattering about, speaking a language only they seemed to comprehend. Lizzie chattered incessantly, recounting some tale of playground heroics, while Tommy intermittently poked his sister, obviously finding joy in her escalating irritation. Their volume rose, unchecked by Aaron or his wife, Claire, who only threw a desperate, "Boys will be boys," my way. When my patience wore thinner than the soup Claire had served, I leaned across the table and muttered to Aaron, "Your kids are wild, man. They've got no home training." It was meant to be a gentle nudge, but the words tumbled out harsher than intended, slicing through the room's uproar. An uncomfortable silence pressed down as Aaron's eyes darkened with something akin to betrayal, a brewing storm beneath his seemingly calm surface. Claire too stiffened, her fork pausing in midair, and for a long moment, it felt as though the whole house held its breath. But then the kids resumed their shrieking breakneck speed as if my comment had been absorbed into the ether. Aaron murmured something under his breath, downcast, but the lightning flashed again in his gaze. "You don't know what it's like," he whispered fiercely once the kids had scampered off into the confines of their own madness, "how hard it is. They're not just naughty, okay?" His voice cracked on the last word, and there was a desperation, a plea hidden in the undertones of his confession. I didn't understand. How could I? It's kids being kids, I thought. But the strange occurrences began after dinner, subtle at first, sudden flickers of the lights and the television volume blaring unexpectedly, the kids giggling somewhere unseen, their laughter full of mischief and shadows. Yet, behind the cheerful mask, there was an unease, a chill in their voices that curdled my blood. Claire quickly dismissed my concern with a weak laugh. "They like to play tricks," she said, but I saw it in her eyes, the same fear flickering like the faulty light bulbs. As the clock inched towards midnight, the house seemed to grow heavier. I felt it in my bones, a tickling sense of dread that curled up like a snake in my gut. I decided then to air my concerns, confronting Aaron with what I saw as the root of the issue, the children. It was then his facade crumbled, revealing a raw edge that was more than exhaustion. Aaron and Claire weren't just struggling parents, they were scared. "Tommy hasn't been himself since Lizzie. Her accident," Aaron confessed shakily. "She was in a coma for days, and when she woke up, she was different." His words echoed ominously. How had I missed it? I'd seen Lizzie only months ago, a sunshine-filled child, brimming with curiosity. Now her eyes reflected a darkness that didn't belong there. "It's like they sensed something," Claire added, her voice trembling as though she were recounting a ghost story around a campfire. "Something unnatural." There it was again, that word. And with it, a heavy silence settled, thicker than the fog outside. A sudden giggle erupted from the shadows of the hallway, and I whipped around to see Lizzie peeking from the doorway, her eyes gleaming in the pale, ghostly light. "We have a new game," she declared, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "Tommy taught me." Aaron's face paled, and in the briefest flicker of candlelight, I saw fear skitter across his features like a living thing. A scream then echoed through the house, breaking the quiet like a shattering pane of glass. Tommy was nowhere to be found, yet the walls seemed to reverberate with his cries. Panic surged through me. I turned to Aaron in confusion, but his attention was elsewhere, fixed on the darkened staircase as if something unseen had caught his eye. Together, we raced through the house, its cramped rooms now a labyrinth pulsing with shadows. By the time we reached the nursery, Aaron's face was etched with a horror so profound, it rooted me to the spot. There, amid the flickering shadows of moonlight pouring through the window, Tommy stood, blank-eyed and whispering into the void. And then I saw it, the reflection behind him. A hunched, grotesque figure lingered just beyond the glass of the old, dust-covered mirror. It was as if the dark had taken form, seeping into reality with an insidious hunger. My gut twisted with nausea and terror as I staggered back, realizing whatever affliction had gripped this home had long clawed itself into the children. Somehow, they'd opened a door that should have stayed closed. Panic-stricken, Aaron and Claire bundled the kids and fled the house, leaving me alone amidst the eerie silence, a silence that held 1,000 screams. Settling into the oppressive darkness, I felt its watchful gaze upon me. Had I been wrong? The words I'd carelessly spoken earlier now echoed back, mocking in my mind. Perhaps they weren't just unruly children. What lingered before them, and now me, inescapably, was something beyond this world, an entity feeding on the innocence of youth, weaving itself into the fabric of their games, their lives. As the clock struck midnight, the house inhaled, and I sensed it, resurfacing with a vengeance, whispering promises of madness. I once thought Aaron's kids just had no home training. In truth, something far darker than rebellion lurked within them, reshaping their reality into a nightmare I could never comprehend. Now, the uneasy quiet settled around me, whispering secrets of bygone terrors, and as I scrambled to leave, the faint echo of a child's laughter drifted gently through the deserted halls, signing my fear and sealing my fate in the house that was both a home and a haunting. When the advertisement for the revolutionary product popped up on my social media feed, it felt more like a godsend than a marketing ploy. The ad was simple: confession, no more onion growing or armpit smell. Antibacterial spray, guaranteed. The declaration was in bold, vibrant letters, and the testimonials beneath it spoke of life-changing freedom from odors once thought to be incurable. At first, I dismissed it as another snake oil gimmick, but after a particularly embarrassing incident at the gym where my body odor cleared the exercise room, the allure of a smell-free existence became too tempting to resist. My friends called me Rick, but the entire office had other nicknames: Stink Bomb, Funky Brewster, and my personal favorite, Ripeness Rick. Personally, I knew the real issue wasn't with my hygiene habits. My perspiration had an aggressive assault on the senses, a demonic gift from my boisterous biology that no amount of showers or clinical-strength deodorants could tame. The package arrived in an unassuming brown box, and the contents looked as innocuous as they were promising: just a small bottle with a clinical logo and that enticing phrase repeated. The instructions were simple: spray directly on the skin's problem areas once a day. As I looked in the bathroom mirror, my coif of curls sticking messily to my forehead, I gave a sarcastic toast to myself and doused each armpit liberally, and then the groin for good measure. Over the next week, the change was nothing short of miraculous. Not only did the pungent onion-like odor cease torturing my olfactory senses, I felt different. Invincible maybe. There was a pep in my step at work, a newfound confidence that stemmed from the absence of the reeking albatross around my neck. Praise replaced the thinly veiled jokes, and I even scored a date with Jessica, the cute accountant I'd been eyeing since forever. Believe it or not, the spray was more effective than I dared dream, but even I was not prepared for what came next. One evening, as I lay in bed, a deep, unyielding itch settled into the depths of my pits and groin. The sensation spread like wildfire, morphing from an irritation to an almost unbearable burning. Underneath it all, a show that my skin felt thicker, tougher, realization dawned on me: too late. I had seen these symptoms before. They belonged to freakish headlines in the back pages of obscure paranormal tabloids. I rushed to the bathroom, splashing my face with cold water. The steam raised by my skin's unnatural heat fogged the mirror. As I raised my arms, sheer horror cascaded through my mind. Where once there had been hair, follicles dark and dense, only smooth scales glistened under the flickering bathroom light. Horrendous, rough scales that shimmered and twitched like creatures with lives of their own. Shuddering, I tried to scratch at them, tried desperately to peel them away, only for the skin beneath to pucker and tear like a rotten fruit. That night, sleep was a stranger, a blessed reprieve snatched cruelly from my grasp as the scales seemingly began their monstrous journey towards confluence, crawling and converging towards my chest, sprouting insidiously along my collars. I woke the next morning, a freshly grown festoon of scales around my neck, like a chain wrought by an unholy blacksmith. Work was impossible. I couldn't go in, couldn't allow anyone to see. My phone buzzed intermittently, the concerned faces of coworkers flashing upon it, but I remained steadfast in my refuge. Desperation clawed at my mind, driving me online for answers or solace. What I found instead were whispers, murmured accounts buried deep within dark forums, posts that hinted at a grotesque community plagued by similar battles. The advertisements were bait, promised miracles that only led to curses unimaginable. Each post a testament to the unending itchiness, to scales advancing on their own sinister journey across skin, and more disturbingly, to transformations that went far deeper. Incredulity pulled at my sanity when I read of those who claimed bipedal humanity was being snatched away from them, transitioning into creatures of nightmares, isolated, feral. The confessions diverged, some laced with the horror of relinquished limbs, others converging on a single grotesque revelation: voices, echoing, whispering, calling from the scales themselves, offers of a future, warnings of inevitability, summoning senses where none had belonged. I was at the brink of madness, spinning out of control, Waves of self-loathing and panic crashing against my resolve. But behind it all lurked an unwelcome acceptance. I was only one among many. Resigned, I dragged myself to the bathroom again, witness to the grotesque spread. The mirror's surface warped as if scorched by the presence of wrongness reflected back at it. What remained of my skin seemed mere patches within a tapestry of scales, my face barely mine and something's else. I had ceased spraying after the first nights, but it was too late for defiance or regret. With each passing day, my senses expanded, cries from the scales louder, clearer. They spoke, not in words, but in impressions, emotions, urgings towards surrender, towards understanding. It was tempting, the allure of synchrony with something greater, something ancient. Grace with a twisted hue as if dipped in the miasma of forgotten eons. I had sought relief, yet found communion, their confessions imprinting upon my soul a succession of revelations I would never fathom as a man. My date with Jessica never happened, couldn't happen, really. I was withdrawn, keeping my transformation hidden from all. The support turned into resignation, and the rumors of my fate possibly wilder than the truth took on lives of their own, becoming a legend for the ages or at least until the next victim found themselves missing morning coffee due to unwanted afflictions. And as I sit here typing my confession to you, dear reader, I feel the unrepentant tug of the void, the gnawing realization that my story is but a fleeting note in the grotesque symphony conducted by the unseen hands of fate. Perhaps you will heed my warning, or maybe curiosity will lead you down a similar path to mine, into the dark company of the scales. Remember, no matter what the promise of sweet release might hold, some solutions cost far more than we are ever prepared to pay. I never imagined my life spiraling into the chaos that I'm now drowning in, but here I am, writing this confession more as a farewell than a plea for help. My name is Jacob, a name I hope hasn't made it into too many police reports yet, but one that's undoubtedly known by a few shadowy figures in the dim back rooms of New York's underbelly. It all started innocently enough, a night of poker with friends on the Lower East Side, the gritty yet vibrant neighborhood that's home to more stories than anyone could recount in a lifetime. That night, I sat across from faces that didn't seem all that menacing at first, men in suits who generously bought rounds for the house, laughed too loud, and were either too interested in their cards or not at all, the kind of nonchalance that should have sent warning bells ringing in my inexperienced head. But the whirlwind of high-stakes betting was intoxicating, and I was too amazed by my own beginner's luck to notice the spiderweb I was spinning for myself. By the end of the night, I was up 20 grand, the smile plastered on my face as fake as the Rolex I wore. Sven, the lead guy, slicked back hair and eyes like a pit of snakes, clapped me on the back a little too hard, congratulating me with a grin that didn't reach the chill in his eyes. It wasn't long before a once-a-month poker game became a weekly ritual, promoted by Sven, who was always a little too generous with credit lines. I thought I was making friends, but I was sinking into the marsh without realizing it. The stakes got higher, the risks bigger, and before long, I owed more than I could imagine repaying. Sven's men, Marco and Luis, weren't exactly forthcoming about interest rates either. By the time I realized how deep I was in, the $20,000 I once won was dwarfed by a debt that seemed impossible to repay. That's when reality started taking a jagged edge, and I wished I could reset my life like one of those pinball machines when a ball gets stuck, except, here, I was the one who was stuck, and the machine was tilted out of my control. Every day after, Sven would remind me with a cheerful menace in his voice about the exposure I was under. Fail to pay, and I wouldn't just be cut off from the game, I'd be cut off permanently from daylight. I tried scraping money together, ignored the simmering panic in my gut that threatened to swallow me whole. But Sven wasn't fond of excuses. He had a reputation to maintain, after all, and he was very keen on reminding me that refusing to pay a business partner would skyrocket his costs, a downfall he wouldn't experience alone. A few persuasive visits later, my fingers taped up and nose bloodied, I knew they weren't just idle threats. Desperation does funny things to a man, it becomes a constant, almost physical companion. I took a second job bartending at a club that didn't ask questions, working myself to exhaustion trying to accumulate enough for a down payment at least. But saving was like trying to catch the tide with a colander, the urgency of Sven's ticking clock always one tick too fast. I considered running, changing my name, and heading to some nameless town in the Midwest. But I had no illusions. If they could find a man halfway across the globe, the prairies wouldn't hide me for long. One chilly evening, walking home under the fluorescent glow of street lamps, reality crashed in another layer deeper. A shadow detached itself from the corner, approaching with the kind of casual intent that screamed danger. Gabe. He was their enforcer, Muscles on top of muscles, hands that could crush stones, and an uncanny ability to appear from nowhere. He didn't say much, just handed me a letter, Sven's seal imprinted ominously, and vanished back into the darkness from whence he came. My hands shook as I opened it, and the black ink might as well have been my own blood. 1 week left or the consequences would be more definitive, the letter said in that perfunctory tone that promised nothing good. With 97 hours and a ticking bomb hanging over my head, I did the unthinkable, I called the cops. Not looking for protection, I wasn't that naive, I knew better than to assume the cops could or would protect me from people like Sven. Instead, I thought maybe a sting or getting them involved would make Sven back off. But the officer who took my call seemed more interested in hints of collusion between me and the mafia than helping me. After a few probing questions, I realized I'd only dug myself deeper, painting a target not just on my back, but on my very life essence. The silence that followed the conversation was deafening, the realization that in trying to help myself, I'd only signed my fate's death warrant struck hard. I was out of time, out of options, yet in that darkest moment, clarity settled in. I had less than 4 days to engineer one last-ditch effort to escape. I started going through my contacts, unearthing fleeting acquaintances whose morality was as questionable as their sobriety. It was a gamble, but my whole life had become a pile of bets on bad horses. I reached out to Troy, a hacker I met once through mutual friends, one of those whose voice you hear but never really see. I promised him a hefty reward if he could ghost my identity, leave enough digital breadcrumbs to distract Sven and his cronies, and give me a day's head start. Money I still didn't have but hoped to scrounge. Troy, intrigued by the chaos and perhaps sympathy wrapped in curiosity at my predicament, agreed. Miraculously, with Troy's digital wizardry, I managed to slip under their radar, at least temporarily. I liquidated what few assets I had, emptied my accounts into untraceable transactions, and slipped away in the dead of night, my heart pounding in rhythm to the city's cacophonous pulse. I left behind the person I was, Jacob, the fool, and embraced the hollow uncertainty of being no one. I stayed in the shadows, moving between cities, hostels, and the occasional sympathetic stranger or another like me, fugitives of our own making. I knew it couldn't last forever, that lurking just beyond the next dawn might be Gabe or one of Sven's men, the end of this game that had already gone on far too long. And as I write this, tucked away in another nameless room far from the bustling heart of the city that swallowed me whole, I realize I am the ghost of my own story, without conclusion. Just an eternal echo lost in the corridors of time. Maybe, just maybe, the writing of this tale will free me, or damn me further, only time will tell. I've always been infatuated with stories, the kind that grip you by the throat and don't let go until you've turned the last page, but this time I find myself caught in a story of my own making that's turning into a tale of horror I never intended. 10 years ago, long before my world crumbled in this breakup, I created this account. Back then, I was just a college student procrastinating assignments and finding solace in the chatter of people who seemed just as lost as I felt. But somewhere along the way, amidst the shared memes and late-night discussions about everything from the paranormal to the mundane, this account became a diary, a personal vault for my thoughts and feelings. I'm ashamed to admit how often I've used it to vent about Lucy, my partner, ex-partner, and our crumbling relationship. Lately, I've felt a detached curiosity exploring the dark corners of this site, seeking distraction from the silence that has filled my apartment since she left. That's when I stumbled upon an old thread about digital spirits. Of course, the logical part of my brain knows it's all nonsense, but it's hard not to feel a chill when you're all alone, reading stories of people who claim their accounts have taken on a life of their own. Wanting to numb my heartache with something more tangible, I disregarded the warnings users shared about these spirits needing a purpose, something to hold on to, and what happens if their existence becomes too entwined with your own. It started 2 nights ago when I awoke to the sound of typing. It was faint at first, like the gentle patter of rain against a window pane, but it grew louder, filling the void Lucy's absence had left behind. At first, I brushed it off as a residual hallucination from my restless sleep, but when I logged in the next morning, I was struck by the peculiar responses from users I barely recognized, asking about cryptic messages I'd supposedly sent them overnight. My inbox was flooded with odd snippets of conversations, void of context, echoing memories of the moments I'd shared with Lucy, as if the account had absorbed my pain and was projecting it back at me. One message stood out, sent from my account, "I'm lost without her." I didn't remember typing it, yet the words resonated with a haunting accuracy, like an echo from my subconscious. Driven by a growing unease, I deleted the messages, hoping that would be the end of it. But the phenomenon persisted, each night's disruption more sinister than the last. Fragments of conversations appeared online, arguments with Lucy, declarations of love that once sealed our bond, and private confessions I had never dared utter aloud. It felt like I was peeling back layers of my past, exposing the wounds I hadn't allowed myself to properly close. I tried everything, reaching out to moderators, changing passwords, even contemplating deleting the account that had stood with me for a decade. Yet, I hesitated. A part of me wondered if surrendering my digital ghost story was akin to severing the last thread tied to a life I wasn't ready to fully let go. Last night, the typing was relentless. Accompanied by the unshakable sense of being watched, I got up to check my office, heart pounding like thunder in the night. The screen glowed an eerie blue, the cursor blinking in time with my racing pulse, typing a repetitive mantra, confess. 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 The word was heavy with demand, as if the account, no, the entity it had become, was urging me to confront something buried deep within my conscience. Haunted by a past I still mourn, sleep-deprived, and teetering on the edge of sanity, I did as it asked. I confessed to the void, whispering to my reflection in the screen the guilt I felt for not fighting harder, for letting the love Lucy and I shared slip through the cracks of mundane life and trivial arguments. The keys were cold under my fingers, but I typed long into the early hours, unearthing secrets and regrets I had buried under layers of denial. The words flowed like blood from an open wound, my jealousy, my selfish moments, my fear of vulnerability. As I emptied my heart into the machine, the heaviness lifted ever so slightly. Exhausted, I passed out with my head slumped over the keyboard. The ominous typing ceased that night, leaving me in silence. Today it feels different. My messages are untouched, as if the account has been satiated by the truths I unveiled. My heart still aches, but the weight is less oppressive, as though sharing those confessions with the anonymous abyss of the internet has unshackled my spirit from the burdens I alone carried. Yet, I can't shake off this eeriness, a paranoia that hasn't left since the typing started. There's a message in my drafts I don't recall writing, I'm free. Thank you. It's not signed. A warning or a farewell, I can't be sure, but I know one thing for certain, I opened a door, and something stepped through. Whether it was a reflection of my inner turmoil or a spirit from the depths of cyberspace, I'm left with a choice, to leave the account as a relic of who I once was or to erase it entirely, severing this bizarre connection. I can't help but wonder, as I gaze into the comforting glow of my screen, whether I'm ready to face what might happen next. And if I do let it go, what phantom might I invite into my quiet solitude? When I was a kid, "Everything will be okay" was my dad's mantra, a soothing melody that played through our home like the notes of an ancient lullaby. I believed it, wrapped myself in its promise like a blanket on a cold night. But childhood innocence is a fragile thing, much like glass that's beautiful yet perilous when shattered. The cracks began when my dad, once the robust pillar of my world, started to slump into himself, like a clock slowly winding down. It first manifested in the little things, missing tools around his workshop, forgotten names of old friends, but when he began confusing my birthday for my sister's, I knew something was terribly wrong. Despite the doctor's white coats and sterile reassurances, their words felt hollow, more for themselves than us. Early onset Alzheimer's. Dad's strong hands that built my treehouse now fumbled with the simplest tasks, shadows haunting the blue of his eyes. I moved back home, abandoning a nascent career, clutching onto threads of our past life, trying in vain to stitch together our unraveling continuity. "Will it get better?" he'd ask, his voice fragile as paper. "Of course, Dad," I'd lunge, hiding the tremor in my voice. But how could I confess? How do you tell the man who taught you bravery that the monster lurking under his bed wasn't one you could scare off with a flashlight? The worst part was the intermittent clarity, the moments where he'd look at me, really look, and whisper, "I'm slipping, sweetheart, aren't I?" I'd choke back the truth, forcing a smile, knowing denial was a privilege I couldn't afford. Every forgotten memory was like a funeral, mourning the loss of pieces of my dad while pretending life went on uninterrupted. Mom tried to maintain her stoic demeanor, yet I saw her falter, misplacing keys and burning dinner more often, as the reality of our situation flayed her sanity. I stepped up, or at least I tried to, cooking meals he forgot to eat, telling stories of our childhood he no longer remembered. The nightmares came next, taunting specters dragging him from sleep to waking confusion, leaving him breathless and me with another flammable reminder that no, nothing was okay. I started recording his better days, convinced that digital memories could survive what biology could not, but every time I watched them, the gaps in his presence echoed louder, a chilling void where affection used to reside. Then came the day I dreaded most, When my name slipped from his memory like sand through an hourglass. "Who are you?" he asked, the desperation in his eyes something my heart never imagined before. Masking my crumbling insides, I answered, "It's just me, Dad," as cheerfully as I could muster. It felt like betrayal, a deceit I willingly wrapped him in. The reality he deserved was beyond my courage to deliver. I fantasized about finding a miracle cure, something to rewrite the unyielding etchings of his diagnosis, but reality is an unforgiving teacher, and all I could do was stand silently beside him, holding onto his hands as desperately as I held onto memories. Now, as we prepare to admit him to a full-time care facility, a kind place with smiling nurses and pastel walls, I am tormented by guilt, the knowledge that I've prolonged the inevitable. As I helped him pack, folding clothes with care, he looked at me with fluid tears pooling in his gaze. "I used to hold you when you cried," he said, a fragile recollection that floored my very soul. "I remember, Dad," I replied, "you always said everything would be okay." As the words left my lips, a bitter laugh escaped my chest because here I was, an adult now, a picture-perfect paradox of the child he once knew, telling the most significant lie of my life. The absence of hope is insidious, burrowing deep, a thief of the sincerest kind. For the truth is, everything will not be okay, and I am terrified of the unknown darkness that awaits once he's gone, a finality to our shared lives. As they gently escorted him away, I lingered behind, clutching a family photo tightly, knowing that while his body might forget, his love will forever haunt the fragments of what remains of my heart. I always believed that I knew every quirk and habit of my husband, Tom, who I had shared the last 7 years of my life with. We built a life together, filled it with laughter, intimacy, and comfort, or so I thought. Lately, though, something was strikingly different about him, and it gnawed at me like a relentless itch I couldn't scratch. It was subtle at first, a fleeting shadow in his eyes that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't comprehend. I dismissed it initially. Everyone has bad days, stress from work or family obligations, and Tom was no exception. But the instances of something being amiss increased, tiny aberrations that seemed inconsequential alone but began weaving an unsettling tapestry when viewed together. Conversations would start with his usual warmth but seamlessly spiral into moments of total vacancy, like he was suddenly absent despite his physical presence. He often repeated stories he'd experienced as if telling them for the first time, swearing he'd never shared them with me before. At dinner, he would crack his usual dad jokes, but upon seeing my laugh, a puzzled look would cross his face as if he didn't understand why I found them funny. In bed, he moved differently, his familiar embrace replaced by a type of mechanical coldness that sent chills down my spine. I brushed these observations aside, attributing them to stress until the night he slept-walked for the first time. It was around 3 a.m. when I shot up in bed, my adrenaline spiking, to see Tom standing eerily still in the corner of our bedroom, facing the wall. My heart hammered as I called out to him, softly at first, then louder. No response. He just stood there, breathing shallowly, whispering something I couldn't quite catch. I got up and gently guided him back to bed, figuring it must be some strange, isolated incident. Except it wasn't. The following nights, it happened again and again, his nocturnal mutterings growing in clarity yet still evading full comprehension. Words like remember, she, and the doorway would slip through his lips, but the threads wove no coherent meaning. He seemed to be existing in some alternate reality during his sleep, one I was desperately intrigued and terrified to understand. I awoke one morning to find him awake already, which was unusual. He was staring out the window, a deep furrow set between his brows, and I caught a glimpse of immense sadness in his eyes, the kind of sadness one sees in someone who's lost everything. When I touched his shoulder, he jolted as if unused to my touch, and responded with a feeble attempt at a smile. "Just tired, I guess," he brushed off, placid and unconvincing. Each day felt like the prelude to an impending storm, and I felt helpless as though bracing for a destruction I couldn't see. The climax came one rainy night when I awoke again to his absence in bed. The house was deathly silent, all but for the murmuring that hummed from somewhere. Carpeted feet led me cautiously down our creaking hallway to the basement door that stood slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling out from beneath it. I swallowed the growing lump in my throat and called out to him, voice breaking against the stillness. "Tom?" No reply followed but the continuing, now recognizable, but still cryptic voice, echoing up the stairs. My curiosity pushed back the fear as I descended. The basement was shrouded in shadows, save for the illumination of an old lamp casting a circle of light on the concrete floor where Tom sat hunched over. With papers strewn around him covered in frantic scribbles that meant nothing to me, he looked foreign in my eyes. He flipped through them, muttering with increasing urgency. When he finally glanced up at me, what struck through my heart was not his evident distress, but the unyielding glaze of recognition, or lack thereof, staring back. It was as if he didn't truly see me, or worse, didn't know me. "I'm remembering," he finally uttered, the refrain hauntingly secured in his tone, something both he and I couldn't quite comprehend. "Remembering what, Tom?" I quivered, the dread was poisoning my every word. "Everything," he replied, this single word draped in a gravity that punctured the air, but still leaving me in darkness. Before I could ask more, he started reciting a date that was in the near future, and my own name punctuating it like a beacon. "Tom, please," I shouted, desperate to rouse him from wherever his mind was trapped. Abruptly, he stopped, his face softening into a mask of confusion as if waking from a deep trance. "Darling. What's happening?" he asked, voice drenched with fear and bewilderment. I managed to pull him up the stairs, back into the light, both of us trembling as the fear danced vigorously between us. The remnants of whatever scenario played in his mind lingered like a penetrating fog, the details buried just beneath the surface of recognition. From that night onwards, Tom gradually returned to his version of normalcy, but the underlying unease remained. I could see it in the flicker of his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. He would occasionally still whisper in his sleep, the words slipping out like ghosts, "Remember. She." The doorway and, heart achingly, my name tethered to an unspoken future. Whatever it is Tom is remembering, whatever doorway he's nearing, I fear it holds something that neither he nor I are prepared to face. It's as if he's caught between two worlds, and I fear the day may come when he crosses a threshold where I cannot follow. As Tom drifts further into this murky sea of half-truths, I keep watching, loving him, but knowing, despite the refusal of my heart to accept it, that something is off about my husband, and perhaps it can never be undone. Growing up, I always believed I struck gold with my adoptive family. From day one, they were incredibly welcoming, offering me more warmth and love than I ever anticipated in my wildest dreams. My new parents, Lynn and Richard, seemed the epitome of generosity and kindness. They had this sprawling old house packed with character, creepy in some ways with its long corridors and creaky floors but charming all the same. Each day blended into a series of golden moments, a laughter-laced life I had never thought possible when bouncing around foster homes. That is until the small inconsistencies began to scrape at the edges of my idyllic world. One day, I overheard a whisper between Lynn and Richard, a mention of keeping it away from her, and though the pragmatic side of my brain tried to brush it off, curiosity gnawed at my gut. They carried dark circles under their eyes, as if plagued by sleepless nights, but their smiles were never waned. Don't even get me started on the basement. The door was always bolted shut, a silent sentinel of secrecy I was instructed to stay away from. My investigations were fueled when I found a picture of a girl, eerily similar to me, nestled inside a dusty, forgotten drawer. She had my eyes, my nose, but her face was one of desperate fear. One day, when my parents were out, I braved the creaky stairs to the basement with the borrowed set of keys. Nearly tumbling with my heart pounding in overdrive, I pushed the door open, expecting to find something banal. What I discovered were walls lined with my photos, every milestone and mundane moment documented methodically like some parental obsession. Yet, there were also photos of another girl as well, the one in the picture upstairs, and her presence was an ice-cold slap to my face. There were scribbles by Richard's shaky hand, "Keep them safe. They must never know." The same fate. As I scoured through stacks of outdated newspapers, horror trickled in. Every article spoke of unresolved disappearances, children who had vanished without a trace, eerily timed around when Richard and Lynn had moved through various towns. It was becoming too much to bear. I ran upstairs determined to confront them. When they came home, I demanded answers, my voice trembling with gathered courage. Unflinching, they exchanged glances filled with a mixture of dread and sorrow I hadn't seen before. "We took you in to protect you," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. They revealed a tale too bizarre to believe, how they were custodians of some ancient curse, bound to keep lost children from being swallowed by whatever shadowy force targeted kids who had no family to care for them, a protector across generations. The girl from the photographs was Lynn's younger sister, taken just before Lynn knew the secret, leaving a lost-shaped ghost that they promised never to see again, not if they could help it. That's why they moved so often, why the basement held frantic memories instead of gifts of affection. They were holding danger at bay, a sinister whisper on the edge of my existence, by crafting not just any family, but a shield. It's rooted in an old pact made under a moonlit sky, A ritual now passed into legend where each adopted child brought with them a key to survival that adults alone could not unlock. Something in the back of my mind scoffed at the elaborate story spun in front of me, yet the earnest fear of my parents, the rawness of their urgency, convinced me they believed it. What choice did I have but to include their fears into my reality, even if it meant living with a match lit under a wick of chilling suspense? I still sleep uneasily, the elements of disbelief still warring in my mind, but more aware now that some things can't be seen nor rationalized, that love sometimes wears an unlikely face, shielded by shadows we might never understand. Yet again, every creak the house makes runs chills down my spine in the ominous silence that often falls after dusk. I swore I heard children's laughter last night, just faintly, as if carried by the wind through the old gables. Richard and Lynn insist it's just the wind, but I catch them casting nervous glances towards the bolted basement door, as if wondering if they truly are the masters of what they've taken on or merely players in a cosmic theater of dread. I've considered running, packing my bags and leaving them to their choices, but something more binding than fear holds me, the warmth of their love mixed with residual terror, knitting the tapestry of my unusual home in a way I couldn't imagine losing. My adoptive family, my very cage and sanctuary, as complex as the stories they wove and the otherworldly intentions they trust. It started like any other dreary Thursday evening, my head pounding after churning through yet another soul-crushing day at the office. The flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows, elongating the figures of the sullen commuters, each lost in their world of monotony. I usually zone out on my way home, my thoughts dulled by the daily grind, but that evening, an unsettling feeling clawed at my consciousness. As I trudged past a particularly ominous alleyway, a soft yet frantic whimper caught my attention. My heartbeat quickened, my instincts screaming for me to ignore it and continue walking. But against my better judgment, I stopped, a magnetic force drawing me in. Peering into the dimly lit gloom, I could barely make out a figure hunched over, their outline trembling in the chill of the night. Swallowing hard, I felt an inexplicable urge to step closer, as if some otherworldly presence was compelling me to intervene. The air was thick with tension, each breath like inhaling the remnants of a nightmare. As I approached, the figure turned slightly, revealing a woman's face streaked with tears and desperation. Instinctively, I crouched down, offering unspoken reassurance because, in that moment, words felt futile. Her eyes, large and pleading, spoke of horrors unsaid, and when she finally choked out the words, it was like a veil lifting, revealing a reality harsher than I could have imagined. Between ragged gasps, she told me about a man, the kind of monster hidden in plain sight, who had promised her salvation but delivered her into a waking hell instead. My mind raced, a fierce internal battle as the beer and Netflix night I had envisioned slipped further from grasp. I tried not to glance nervously over my shoulder, telling myself that he couldn't possibly be close, that this scenario couldn't be as dire as it seemed. Clenching my fists to steady my nerves, I helped her up, her skin shockingly cold against mine. As we moved out of the shadows, I strained my ears for any signs of pursuit, the new silence somehow more oppressive than the noise of the city around us. In hushed tones, I learned that she had been captive for the past week, taken from her normal life to serve someone else's dark intentions. I shook my head in disbelief, my brain struggling to catch up with the situation, desperate to wake from this nightmare. We made our way hastily toward my small apartment, each step gaining speed, driven by the urgency of newfound purpose. She clung to me as if I were a lifeline, the night encroaching upon us with every fearful glance I cast into the abyss of the alley. By the time we reached my building, I realized the absurdity of what I'd done, inviting a stranger into my home, no clear plan or thought about what came next. But there was no turning back, an insidious part of me had already decided that this was right. She flinched at the scrape of the elevator doors closing, a reflex honed by the horror she'd endured. Inside my humble, cluttered living room, I offered her a cup of tea with hands that trembled, trying to mask my growing panic under a veil of concerned authority. The shift in setting brought a brief, illusionary calm. Here, amidst the familiar scent of my morning coffee and clutter of my uninspired life, she seemed to shed some of the fear, though shadows still lingered in her eyes. She spoke sparingly now, as if fearful that putting experiences into words might solidify their horror. Her words sketched an image of a world parallel to mine, one where people become pawns and survival isn't guaranteed. I listened, spellbound by the sheer force of her survival instincts, my mind barely able to grasp the full extent of her endurance. We talked through the night, my questions tentative, afraid of triggering more pain yet eager to understand. It dawned on me that beyond horror films and urban legends, evil truly exists in our world, lurking in corners we often overlook. At first light, The realization slammed into me that decisions must be made. I had to act, really act, not just react, to bring someone truly responsible into this unfolding nightmare. I contacted the police, battling the fear of what her captors might do if they sensed she was no longer under their thumb. In the ensuing hours, a flurry of uniformed officers and sincere promises appeared, the gravity of the situation sinking slowly yet deeply into their practiced professionalism. Throughout it all, she remained by my side, clutching onto the solidity of someone who listened, who believed her when others would question. My once mundane world swirled with chaos, and by the end of it all, she was whisked away to a place of safety. As I watched her leave, something intrinsic within me shifted. I'd played a part in saving a life, yet an emptiness seeped in. Here I was, the unlikely hero in a story that seemed far-fetched even as I narrated in my head. The sheer surrealness of it all, how my ordinary yet comfortable life intersected with the edge of human darkness, was what struck me most. No friends to tell, no family expectant of my call, my account holds lesser weight than those photos that accompany a news headline, snippets of a stranger's unfolding tragedy. I've thought to write her story here, half temptation, half warning, urging those like you to heed cries in the darkness overlooked. Yet speaking aloud feels like betraying a sacred trust, the anonymity her tormentor relished, now undone, a quiet insurrection of a simple life intersected by fate's gnarled hand. So now I sit here, words pouring into ether, into you, reader, confessing not just to the audience, but perhaps to the universe. I hold pieces of another's survival, echoing truths that still haunt the recesses of my nights, casting shadows too vast for my single, inscrutable soul to anywhere else to ever share.